Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. We were really excited that we can have Eric come and join us to talk about climate planning. So I know that most of you, not all of you, have worked in a local context with cities or counties on planning related efforts and know that it is a really crucial element to building towards infrastructure projects or broader projects that help community in some way. And so we're really glad that we can take a little time to dive into some of the specifics around planning, how it works to influence project and investments, and then how plans might actually be able to be leveraged to achieve some of the goals that you and your communities have around equity and justice. And then thinking about how you might be able to connect this to some of your own work. We're also going to spend a little time, or Eric rather, is going to spend a little time talking about SB 1000, which I'm sure also some of you have with, and I think is a really promising tool that communities and community-based organizations can use to achieve some of those goals. And then we'll have a little time, quite a bit of time actually, for discussion, just acknowledging that so many of you have experience with this and might kind of want to share and have some back and forth about this topic since you're well versed. So with that, I think I'll pass it over to Eric, and just a reminder to introduce yourself, where you're from, and the organization you're with in the chat. So take it away, Eric. Thank you for being here.
Awesome. Thanks, Coral. And once again, just hello, everyone. And thanks for having me in the room with you guys today. Excited to provide a little supplemental training on planning, climate planning, and especially about community engagement and connecting some of the work you've already been doing, potentially with planning in your communities and what local agencies might be doing. So let me just take an awkward pause here to try to share my screen, and we'll try to get things underway momentarily. All right, I think most folks can probably see that. Is that correct, Coral?
Yeah, I can see it on my end.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, my windows sometimes tend to jump around a bit, but looks like we're live here. Okay, great. So I'm going to be doing kind of just a very general planning 101 type lecture, so to speak. You call me Professor Eric, if you will. But I'll also be taking a deeper dive on SB 1000. So I'll be switching slide decks kind of in the presentation. I think what we were going to do is do the planning 101 first and have a little bit of Q&A after about 10 or 15 minutes or so of me talking, and then we can do a deeper dive on SB 1000 and have more Q&A after that. So hopefully that works for everyone still. So planning 101, here we go. And boy, trying to get my slides to advance. Oh boy, it's doing that. I have to hit the space bar every time. This is fun. Okay, so again, my name is Eric D. Koch, Deputy Director, Planning and Community Development at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. I'll be talking to you today about planning. The first thing I just wanted to start off with, for those that may be very new to local governance or planning, is kind of what is land use planning. And I'll start with what we kind of use as the textbook definition from Fulton's Guide to California Planning. This is a very traditional planning textbooks that planners often read in their planning training. And planning is really the process by which public agencies, mostly local governments, determine the intensity and geographical arrangements of various land uses in a community. Okay, seems pretty straightforward and academic, right? Words, planning is how we decide what gets built, what doesn't get built, and where. So that's a very simple definition that I actually kind of like better. It really is that local process. It's an inherently political process. The community engagement piece in this is so critical, and it really, in a lot of ways, defines the planning process. It's how we decide as people how to govern and manage the growth and change in our communities. Planners, obviously, we often tend to ask and answer a lot of questions. We ask legal questions like, is this plan that we have lawful? Is in terms of politics, is this acceptable to decision makers? There's social questions around planning that we ask and answer about who wins, who loses in these decisions. What about equity, right? How we advance equity in our communities. There are economic questions about what are the costs and benefits of these planning decisions that we're making. We have fiscal analyses and questions about How are we going to pay for all this new housing or this new infrastructure that we want to build? What about revitalizing our neighborhoods? How are we going to do that? Who's going to pay for this, and where the revenue is going to come from to do that, right? So this is also a really critical planning question. There are intergovernmental questions, right? So local governments don't have control over everything, nor do neighborhoods. So who's really responsible at the end of the day? Is it can get quite complex. So there are intergovernmental and cross-agency coordination questions that we ask in planning. In terms of values, really important question planners often ask and try to answer is, what are the community's true needs and values as we go to plan for the growth and change in our communities? What do we need to recognize as value, or how are those values changed? We often ask environmental questions. What might be the effects on people and or our natural resources as we make these decisions? How do we address or mitigate impacts? And last but not least, how are we going to manage all this, and who's really in charge of this plan, right? And so these are really important questions that tend to drive planning. Some of the traditional issues in planning in California, obviously, that we all are thinking about daily, and many of you are thinking about these things as well. We have to look at housing, right? Transportation. We look at the kind of the underground infrastructure, right, that it takes to support development or the way we live, whether it's sewer, drainage, water, other public infrastructure. We think about the compatibility of land uses or changes in land use over time and what we need to do about that. Orderly subdivision of land, retail, office. You see the different lists here on the screen. I'm not going to read them all. These have been the traditional planning issues that local agencies have been required to plan for decades. So these hasn't changed a lot. But on this next slide, this is kind of the landscape right now of current, or what we call current or emergency policy issues in our planning. We're doing a lot of work in OPR, and I think local governments across the state are waking up to the realities that we need to focus differently on the equitable distribution of resources. We understanding more so than we have in the past about the kind of the racist history of redlining. We're thinking about inclusionary zoning. We're thinking about how to do transformative economic development, right? There's also a growing set of policy push to do better work on preservation of our natural resources. Environmental justice and climate resilience are also major shifts in policy and guidance recently from the state on this, and we'll talk about them more exclusively later. We even have issues like public health, the current pandemic we all have just lived through and are not quite out of yet. What is this new normal? Our patterns, our daily lives have been changed so much, we're not sure what to plan for. And so this is kind of the shifting landscape under our feet even now. There's a lot of emerging talk about what does the future look like. So just wanted to acknowledge that the planning policy landscape has shifted and continues to shift. And we continue to do that work at OPR to try to track this and try to provide guidance to communities as they plan. Now, in terms of how planning actually happens in California, right, we have a statewide legal structure. The state does have a set of laws, and there's a procedural structure by which we must do planning, and I'll talk about that shortly. And local governments are required to address specific issues, which we'll also talk about in more detail. But just know that local governments are actually given a fair amount of leeway in determining exactly what policies or implementation programs they decide to put in their plans. There's very little actual coordination required by law in the state. And in fact, most of our adopted plans in California are actually enforced by the people. OPR does not have regulatory authority, even though we're the state's planning agency. We don't have oversight or enforcement over general plan law. There's a few exceptions, the one of which is the housing element portion of the local government's plans is regulated by the Department of Housing and Community Development. So that is one area where the state has some teeth. But in general, local plans just aren't enforced by the state. So just want folks to be aware of that as we move forward. So what are the building blocks of California, right? So we have, first of all, the general plan, this high level community-wide comprehensive plan. And underneath that general plan, there's a series of laws or other more locally specific plans that local governments can adopt. Local governments must have zoning and subdivision ordinances that are consistent with state law. They also very often do what we call capital improvement planning, right? That feeds the information about what infrastructure or physical projects need to be built by public agencies to support development. When we think about specific planning decisions that are made, let's say at the individual property scale, let's say at the block scale, we tend to call those development projects. Sometimes you'll see local governments prepare what we call area or neighborhood plans. and of course, individual infrastructure projects. So all these sort of nest under the general plan, which is kind of that high level land use constitution for the community. And then as we work our way down into the tree here, you see you get to more specificity in planning. So sometimes people will call the general plan long range planning, right? Or updating a zoning code can be considered a long range exercise. And then that bottom layer of the cake is what we would call kind of current planning, when specific decisions need to be made about specific approvals that need to be planned for and approved. So why prepare a general plan? Well, state law does require that every city and county adopt a general plan. So those are the two units of government that have to have general plans. Special districts don't have to have general plans. State agencies don't do general plans. They're basically local city and county obligations. They are the basis, as I mentioned earlier, for local land use and related planning decisions. They identify important issues to the community. All of our guidance at OPR very strongly promotes robust and ongoing public participation in these processes. And so we can talk about that a little bit more when we talk about SB 1000 as well. But basically, yeah, general plans set the ground rules, and they really, in short, are the community's master plan, and they guide growth and change. We do have a set of zoning and planning and laws. We won't get into the weeds on that today. I've put an image on the right-hand side on this slide of OPR's general plan guidelines, because that's the place in a 400 or 500 page document. There's a lot of guidance for what all the different building blocks of planning must be in a general plan and how to address those. We do go over the statutory requirements or the legal minimum kind of components, as well as what we guide communities into doing to keep their general plans updated and consistent with the intent of state law. So what topics must be in a general plan? We have land use, circulation, which can cover transportation as well as other infrastructure, conservation, open space, noise, safety, housing, as I mentioned earlier. In some communities in California, they must do an air quality element. This is only in the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District area. So that's one particularity about air quality. And then environmental justice, which while it is a mandatory topic statewide, it technically only applies to communities that have defined disadvantaged communities. And we'll talk about that under the SB 1000 piece. There are other broad-based topical considerations that OPR strongly encourages communities to put into their plans, and there is some overlap with some of the other mandatory topics. We do have health and equity. We strongly promote resilience, and I would like to spend a lot more time on this. I think maybe in Q&A we'll get to this too, but we do have a mandatory climate adaptation requirement in the safety element per se. So even though climate adaptation doesn't appear under mandatory, local governments do have to look at that in the safety element. But of course, OPR does encourage a broader framing of resilience throughout the general plan. And so we can talk about that later as well. Economic development, and of course, community engagement, like I mentioned, we recommend that throughout the planning process. Let's talk a bit about zoning. We won't get into the weeds on this, but just know that per the diagram I showed earlier, it is a regulatory tool that every local government must use to implement their general plan. And it, like most land use regulation, it sort of emerged as a tool, over a century ago, mostly by property owners to protect their self-interest, whether it was to protect property value. Sometimes that was exclusionary or racist in nature, where redlining was used, but it has become the de facto tool still by which local governments do regulate land use and different aspects of development. Traditionally, it was based on a rigid separation of uses, some of it for, like, again, social issues. Some of it was based on keeping pollution away from people. So it did have sort of a rigid separation of use. Zoning has evolved over time, of course, to allow for more mixed use zoning, like allowing uses, like maybe you do want a grocery store you can walk to in your neighborhood, for example. And we've also seen more communities in recent decades or so look more at form-based zoning, where they're less concerned about the strict separation of uses, and they're really just trying to control on an individual community level how development feels and functions, and less so on the strict separation of land use. Zoning can be combined with other standards into a development code, and so sometimes you'll see community zoning embedded in a bigger, broader, what we call planning and development code, or a development code. So just know that sometimes the zoning is buried in there. So zoning does have 4 dimensions. I mentioned the separation or mixing potentially of land uses. Zoning also controls what we call bulk. So that is basically how tall building, where the step backs from the street must be, right? So we call that bulk. Sometimes planners will use a kind of a wonky term called floor area ratio to regulate bulk, but just know that that's another piece of zoning, right? It's not just how you use the land for residential or industrial or commercial. That bulk can speak to how the development looks and feels on the landscape. We also have performance. Sometimes there are performance standards in zoning that require development to do certain things as it gets built or as it operates over time. And of course, there is that time-based component as well in some zoning codes. Another big piece of zoning is the map, right? So I've thrown on here an image that just shows what a zoning map in some communities might look like. And it can sometimes appear in this very hodgepodgey sort of a way where there's all these different colors with different symbols. And those typically correspond back to the written code that says in that residential district, and let's say that the RS here is like residential single family, maybe only single family is allowed and maybe at a certain density, like 8 dwelling units per acre. Whereas maybe a commercial zoning allows like big box retail or small mom and pop shops, and only those uses are allowed over there. And then some, like I mentioned earlier, might be mixed use, and that might have like an MX or some type of a symbol that indicates mixed use. But just know that zoning is a tool that's not just a written set of rules, it usually has a map that corresponds with it as well. Another tool we see happening through local planning is specific plans. And specific plans are sort of like a hybrid between zoning and like a neighborhood or an area-wide focus or like a district plan. These tend to be more master plan developments. They're done for larger properties with multiple owners. Sometimes we've seen communities use specific plans for like downtown revitalization projects or to create transit-oriented or affordable housing type districts around transit stations. They do have to be consistent with general plans. Sometimes they do have area-specific zoning, and by law, they must have their own infrastructure and financing plan associated with those plans. So that's just a quick overview of kind of the landscape around planning in California when we talk about land use planning and all those components that must be in a general plan, zoning, specific plans. I did want to talk a little bit about community engagement and how this works. Like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's sort of 2 big types of planning, right? We've got this long range planning where a community is opening up its city or county-wide plans, or maybe it's opening up its zoning, maybe it's updating its housing element because HCDs require them to do that. This is the opportunity where communities can really engage and inform the long range goals and vision and framework for decision making that agency will use over a longer period of time, like a 10 to 20 year time frame. It's usually a lot more extensive in terms of the engagement opportunities. You'll see cities and counties doing engagement at various scales, and many of you may have seen that be happening already, where your city or your county might be having workshops, maybe there's listening sessions, maybe there's online workshops or chat rooms or breakout sessions where people talk about specific topics. The planning process for a general plan update, or let's say an area-wide plan, a specific plan, can often take years. It's not something that's done and over and quick. So it does require a lot of commitment to stay engaged. Some of the best practices that we're seeing that we'll talk about shortly is really seeing cities and counties doing a better job at reaching out to under-resourced communities and disadvantaged communities. The SB 1000 push, which we'll talk about in a minute, has also been a big reason why we're seeing a lot better engagement and more holistic and comprehensive engagement, and not just to those that have the time and resources to do so. When we talk about community engagement around current planning, this tends to be much more limited and short term. It's kind of a fast-paced type of engagement. It's more focused often on the immediate proposed project, like someone wants to build, let's say, a 500 unit development on a large parcel in a community, or it might be an expansion of the community into a specific area of farmland. Sometimes these projects do require public review and there'll be public hearings on this, but just know that not every project or building that gets built is always going to require public review. There are some types of development that are approved by right. That means that all they need is a building permit and you will never have an opportunity to weigh in on those. For local agencies that do engage in public process and do open up public hearings, the best practice around that is for those local agencies to do early notification and have a clear engagement process for neighborhood groups, for individual citizens, so that people will know these types of projects, we will notify you early. We'll maybe do it within 30 days of receiving an application. And we'll tell you when the first hearing is or what level of review the project is subject to. That really is best practice. We're also seeing a lot of communities being asked to actually streamline the development process, so there is less public engagement. And this has the unfortunate byproduct, of course, of reducing the opportunities for sort of project level engagement by communities. But what we're hoping people are doing out there is streamlining the kind of housing, especially in affordable housing, that people want to see, and not having that be hung up in public review every single time. We've seen a lot of NIMBYism in California, right? Not in my backyard, where well-to-do folks or folks that are just anti-development next to them want to stop projects. So there's been a lot of work done by the legislature and others to fast track or streamline development that's consistent with local plans and zoning. And for other communities, they're just not in that space, and they're still opening a lot of development decisions up to local review and scrutiny. So every community is in a different place by that, but just know that my last point here is really, I think for folks that are really entering the space of being more engaged in local planning, it really, especially in the current planning space, it's about being organized and basically getting up to speed and learning how each local agency that you interface with is reviewing and approving development projects at different scales, right? And which ones are going to be open to public review and which ones generally are not. So that kind of just concludes my Planning 101 overview. I know we wanted to take a quick break in case there were questions. So happy to stop here and open up the mic.
Hi, this is Martha Armas Kelly, and I had a question. In regards to SB 1000 and the teeth that most jurisdictions have, are there any teeth on any of these mandates that we're asking for? Because I come from Stanislaus, and they've been written letters and been given like warnings, and they're still not doing anything. So I'm wondering, at one point there was going to be a revision on the SB 1000 to include a little bit more of an enforcement factor. So is that something that you're still proposing? And if so, what are some of those things that you're looking to add or make to strengthen that core of having some kind of accountability towards those measures?
Really good question, Martha. The reality around OPR, at least our agency, is we have no regulatory enforcement authority whatsoever. So we don't write the laws either. I mean, we get engaged sometimes with the legislature when they're considering amendments to the law. So we have engaged in some discussions. I know that, the original SB 1000 bill, Senator Leyva, has been very interested in upping the enforcement provisions in state law to some degree, but we haven't seen anything meaningful come through the legislative process in the last few years on that. So we know that she continues to be interested, and I know that other legislators continue to ponder this as well. I will say, just on the enforcement piece, even though we can't enforce anything on, let's say, SB 1000, our state attorney general has taken an interest in this topic in the past. And now that we have a new attorney general, there still remains within the attorney general's office an environmental justice bureau that has actually actively commented on city and county general plans that they feel aren't really living up to the letter of the law and really staying consistent with guidance. So you can see some of the work they've done. They've posted, I think, 12 or 14 letters or so that have gone out to different cities and counties in the last few years, where they're really, as a state's enforcement agency, essentially on all legal matters, they have taken an interest in this issue. So you will see sometimes the AG deciding to intervene and submit comments.
Yeah, I've had the opportunity to sit on some of those conversations with the state attorney general, but I know that the transition, that's what I was worried about, because, like, who will pick up that work? Will it just die with the new, office and how it works? But thank you. I just wanted to bring that to attention.
Sure, thank you.
And then I see that Fatima has her hand up.
Hi, yeah, this was a really awesome presentation. Thank you so much for this overview. I think when we think about rules and laws, right? I mean, the system is working as it was designed to for those that benefit from it. And I am very encouraged with the EJ element. And I'm also really excited about, thinking about not moving beyond like just looking at housing per se, and even energy or other kind of factors. But I wonder if there's an opportunity to look beyond that to perhaps, I guess I'll call it like real equity, right? And establishing those standards or metrics. And I think that kind of speaks to what Martha was talking about, is like, how do we kind of maybe establish some standards or metrics, or even kind of, operating procedures for this work for the state. I'm thinking about Greenlining Institute's Making Equity Real guidebook, and perhaps an opportunity to have some standard operating procedures, right? And I think that lends itself to this idea of getting to that level of accountability, right? Or that measurement. And so I guess a couple things that came up for me is looking beyond just housing as like the different elements, but like, how do we look beyond to the structures and the types of housing models? So for example, like housing cooperatives, and being really mindful of, I think, the monopolies that exist, right? Whether it's in energy or whether even in housing, this concept of being a renter forever, has to change, right? If we really want to talk about equity, it's about ownership. It's about more control. And I'm fascinated with this idea of like the community engagement piece, because I'm really, really struggling with that, because in one aspect, it's like the communities that are being asked to engage, they are like legit not the, let's say, like creators of the problem, right? Like they literally just bear the brunt of racist policies and zoning. And so even asking, I think, communities who have now maybe disproportionate health and other, like they're working and they just can't engage, they don't know how, they're not as sophisticated, right? That's like the word that's used in like development community. So I guess having that legacy of just like lack of knowledge and technical know-how, I think it's a bit challenging for communities to even like enter the conversation, like when these are very technical things, right? So that's one, I think, disadvantage of the whole community engagement process, where I feel like I'm a little disappointed in it. And then the other piece, though, is like you said, like the streamlining aspect of like, oh, now let's just kind of like move projects forward, which is great for some projects around housing. But I wonder again, if when we talk about CEQA, I think a lot of people think it means something very different than what it really does. And if there was a way to like, okay, whether you have community engagement or not, if there were, again, standards of equity and economics and environment, right, to ensure that these things are protected, then perhaps whether or not you have community engagement, you could still protect most vulnerable, I think, disadvantaged populations. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for. And then lastly, to say, like, thinking about like accountability and regulatory, I was curious to find out, like, so I know like in the housing element, like HUD is doing some things around like the regional housing need assessment and almost like mandating local jurisdictions to address the need for extremely low or low affordable housing. And so I wonder if there's ways to do that for other metrics beyond housing. Sorry, I know it's very long-winded, but.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and quickly just say, Fatima, thanks for really good questions and comments there. I just would love to just have a long conversation with you about a lot of that. I will say, just on your last point and question, I think that, you'll see HCD promoting all of that very strongly in this current housing element update cycle. We didn't get a chance to go over all of the complexity of California's regional housing needs allocation process and how that goes from the region down to the locals. But just know that HCD is doing a lot of work to sort of promote fair and equitable housing policy, not just where housing is built, but also even in retrofitting and upgrading existing and preserving the housing stock we have, and making sure that we're being mindful of the equity and justice implications around the condition of the housing we already have. So that's definitely all in there. And as we get into the SB 1000 part of the presentation, I'll be touching on that more specifically as well, because I think you'll see there's a lot of really great nexus between what happens when we introduce environmental justice element of the general plan and what it begins to say about all the other traditional general plan building blocks. So, and I know there's other hands up, so I don't know, I'll just defer to our facilitators here. Do we want to keep in Q&A? Should I blast forward on the SB 1000? What's the best next step here?
I'd actually like to see if Nancy and Anita, do you mind if we go through this next piece on SB 1000 quickly? I think it might help inform some of the conversation we're having right now, and then we'll prioritize you two for the first questions after that piece. Does that work for everybody? Okay, great. Oh, Eric, you're still on mute.
All right, I'm going to switch gears from one presentation to another, so just give me a moment to do that. Closing out one, opening another. Okay, that should do it. Okay. Okay, looks like that worked. So, okay, this is basically a presentation. I've compressed it down. It's basically based on some of the workshops that OPR did or webinars that we did on our new environmental justice guidance last year. So it's pretty current still, and it kind of reflects the latest guidance that we published in June of 2020. Gosh, almost a year ago already, wow. But anyway, so we've sort of customized it down for this group here. I think a lot of folks might be aware of this, but just a quick review of what SB 1000 is and what it did. It added a new mandatory topic to the general plan law that requires that all cities and counties in California that have disadvantaged communities must have an environmental justice element or an equivalent set of policies and programs spread through the other elements of their general plan. So local governments have a little bit of flexibility in that. Local governments also ultimately are the ones that decide who and who is disadvantaged. So there are some statutory definitions that we'll talk about in the presentation here, but just know that that is at the local agency's discretion to make that determination. This law did kick in January of 2018, so we're a little bit over 3 years into the compliance period. And it does, I'll go over the specific kind of process diagram as well. Based on our analysis and some work with the CalEnviroScreen 3.0 version of the screening tool around who is disadvantaged, at least for the overall state definition, we know that at least 240 cities and counties in California meet that criteria. And there could be more because of the way that the law was written. It allows local governments some discretion and some flexibility in terms of looking at other criteria, which we'll talk about as well. But this is a little less than half of local governments in California. So it's a pretty huge chunk. And it's probably at least three quarters of the state's population is in one of those cities and counties as well. You know, there is a state definition of environmental justice outside of SB 1000 as well. And I just wanted to highlight that because as we went about writing guidance for SB 1000, we wanted to make sure that we captured a lot of the definitions that are already codified and have been in state law for quite a long time. You know, there's a language that talks about a healthy environment, right? So we're concerned about health. We're concerned about the deterrence, reduction, and elimination of pollution burdens for those who are experiencing them and were disproportionately impacted, right? There's also a really strong, you look at these last 2 points though, points C and D. This is not even SB 1000, you guys. This is about local governments engaging in providing technical assistance to the most impacted populations, about promoting their meaningful participation and all phases of environmental, and what I really like here is land use decision-making, right? So this has been in the law for a while. The meaningful consideration and recommendations from populations, communities most impacted by environmental land use decisions. So we consider this to be sort of the framing, really in a lot of ways, for the comprehensiveness of our guidance that, you know, SB 1000 is not a long set of, it's a pretty short set of statements, but there's a huge set of implications around what the state already expects around environmental justice, which we thought was critical. So what's really required? So we mentioned disadvantaged communities. We'll talk about those definitions in a second. The other triggering point is the public agency is technically not required to start looking at doing an EJ element if they meet the disadvantaged criteria, unless they're updating 2 or more elements of their general plan. So it's not just a one-off deal. It usually is sort of triggered by a more comprehensive update to a local general plan. Of course, local agencies can decide to do an EJ element at any time, and we do strongly encourage that. But just know that some of the more resistant agencies are really waiting until they're hitting this kind of 2 or more element update threshold. So if you meet all the criteria and you are down the path, what must you do? So you must be prepared then to do an EJ element that reduces the unique or compounded health risks, and by means that include, but are not limited to, and I think that phrase is important, reducing pollution exposure, looking at equitable access and construction of public facilities, promoting healthy food access, safe and sanitary homes. So there's that housing piece and the housing nexus, promoting physical activity, promoting civic engagement, and of course, prioritizing the needs of disadvantaged communities, especially in the implementation of a general plan. the law does talk about screening. It doesn't use the word screening, but OPR is creating this term screening because the law has several different definitions of who might be disadvantaged. The first place that's called out is basically the 75th percentile. So the census tracts that meet the disadvantage criteria in CalVIRE screen. But for SB 1000, local governments should also be looking at other low-income areas that have disproportionate health burdens. And so there's two different income indicators. One is census tracts that are at or below the median statewide median income. It can also mean areas that are at or below the Department of Housing Community Development or HCD state income limit. So there's two different income criteria. And what we've done is recommend that local governments sort of look at all three and then really take a close look at community-specific data on health risk, pollution burdens. A big part of this as well is community engagement, right? So it's not just enough to do a bunch of mapping and data analysis. We're really strongly encouraging local agencies to talk to communities that they feel may meet some of these criteria and begin to draw up that qualitative data about lived experience, looking at conditions and really having that conversation with the community before making a final decision who might be considered disadvantaged or under-resourced for planning purposes under SB 1000. And so by the time communities have done that, they get to this final screen, which is kind of a comprehensive approach to going for, a data-driven analysis as well as a conversation with their communities. Of course, we could get into the weeds on each of those specific components about what it means to take action on environmental justice. And I won't probably have time to get into the specifics on each of these today. I'm just going to do quick highlights. Obviously, pollution exposure is the number one issue called out in traditional environmental justice work, right? So we want to look at air pollution, water pollution, soil, other health hazards. A lot of the data that tell us about the disproportionate burdens are in CalVIRE screen, but there are other issues local governments might want to look at. And when we're looking at actionable policy or meaningful action around addressing these issues, the state actually has a lot of work underway that we encourage local agencies to align with. We have the Community Air Protection Program that CARB is implementing along with local air districts. That's such a foundational piece for looking at disproportionate air pollution impacts in disadvantaged communities. We also have safe drinking water programs, especially I know a lot of our communities in our Central Valley, Southern San Joaquin Valley are experiencing severe issues around inequitable access to safe and clean drinking water. And so there's some really great tools and programs the state is promoting around that issue, which we really like to see local governments aligning with. Public facility is another one, food access, and there's just a lot of great work being done around availability, access to, and utilization of healthy food options. Our own State Department of Food and Ag's Office of Farm to Fork has done a lot of work on making sure we're integrating equity and justice into these programs. We have safe and sanitary homes. I mentioned earlier in the previous presentation about not just new construction, but looking at our existing housing stock and are we seeing inequitable burdens and housing that needs to be upgraded to safety standards where we have bad air quality indoors. So these are the sort of issues we're hoping folks are looking at in their EJ elements. Physical activity, of course, aligning with all the great work that Caltrans, our STC colleagues in Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, TCC, the Transformative Climate Communities Program, really thinking about ways to pair active transportation investments with our affordable housing investments. So a lot of great precedent there, but local governments have a huge role in this too, of just going above and beyond what the state is funding as well. And so we're hoping that that's making its way into these local plans as well. The last thing I wanted to cover before I open it up for Q&A, well, we're going to do this in a little bit more on community engagement, but really one of the big opportunities we see when we look at the broader category of unique or compounded health risks are these bigger system-wide or almost like environment-wide issues that are affecting our vulnerable communities disproportionately, right? So we have climate change, the impacts of climate change, climate vulnerability. We also have this new phenomenon of pandemic and looking at who suffers the most in pandemics. So we're really hoping that local agencies are taking the opportunity to align their work on responding to pandemics or broader climate impacts and thinking about prioritizing the needs of vulnerable communities in the context of their EJ element, not just in the safety element, but thinking about the connection point between environmental justice, natural hazards, and long-term safety of disproportionately affected communities. So that's a big piece of the guidance as well, and definitely something we're promoting as well. Last but not least, civic engagement. It's a requirement in the EJ element under SB 1000. And there's just a lot of great thinking that's gone into this about engaging communities directly in the EJ element development itself. But more importantly, we think, is the implementation of this EJ and the monitoring of its effectiveness over time. We want to see that civic engagement be a continuum that goes from general plan development all the way through to implementation, and really asking folks to go beyond just informing and consulting their communities, involving, collaborating, and best of all, empowering communities to help make decisions and be in the process and not just a voice that can easily be cast aside later. So this is a huge priority and something we talk about extensively in the EJ guidance about what that can look like in the context of the EJ element. So anyway, I know I'm running a bit over time and wanted to leave more space for Q&A on this as well. So just a quick overview, happy to engage in more questions. Thanks.
Awesome. So I think from before we had Anita first with a question and then Nancy before we open it up to more Q&A.
So I don't know that I'm actually going to say the same that I did before, but I agree with Fatima in the sense that, you know, that there is an element to all of this that needs to be relooked at with the authentic, you know, equity lens. And so with that being said, my experience is it all looks excellent on paper, but the implementation is so spotty, and depending on the level and the size of the city and the available staffing and so many different things, you don't really see it playing out the way that it's envisioned, entitled. So I was sharing with Fatima yesterday that a community that I've worked in that has been invested, you know, at least $6 million on behalf of the Kaiser Foundation to do healthy eating, active living, to even put in a health and wellness element into their general plan. Still, after 8 years, 9 years of these investments in the community, decided to bring in 3 different fast food restaurants as a way to promote economic business, right? Over the fact that they have received these funding. So the challenge here is, if there is no accountability, if there is no, what's the word that we were using, enforcement, can there be accountability? In the sense, if you receive these types of fundings, it precludes you from doing X, Y, and Z, right? So that you are actually aligned with what you're saying publicly as well as your actions. Because there should be no reason that for economic boosting, you put out a small business, Black-owned business that sells the same product at a corporate rate, but you receive funding to do health and wellness element things and have consistently preached we want to do this. So I think I want to say that, one, that there is some accountability that does not have to be enforcement. And 2, that similarly, when they are not landowners, there is a huge way for them to say, well, we cannot. So the school districts oftentimes are landowners. And in this particular community, they absolutely are the largest landowner. So are there elements that can be implemented, or are there even policies that can support the school districts in ensuring access to those, whether, let's just say, for example, healthy food and physical activity, without having to jump through more political hoops to make that available. So those are 2 things that I want to bring up, is the role and impact that institutions play in terms of this work and working alongside these small local governments, but also separating enforcement from accountability. I don't know if that's a question, I'm sorry.
No, I totally hear you, Anita, and we can put out the best guidance, publish case studies all we want, but at the end of the day, it really does come down to political will, to making the overall governance and community engagement process across the agency equitable. And that's not something that is going to happen quickly in some communities. They're still in this place where they don't even get it. And my only response to that is, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're participating in PACE, and because you're the leaders that are going to take that conversation forward. And it's not something that is going to be easy, but I have more power to you as you work in your own communities. And I think that, you know, there are other opportunities, and we're hoping that as the state advances its work on environmental justice, even outside of SB 1000, that the message does start to get through to other type of institutions where the general plan really doesn't have any specific weight. You mentioned school districts, you mentioned special districts. There's a lot of work that needs to be done across all types of policy and governance that really have nothing to do with the general plan, or where the general plan might have very marginal influence, for example. So I want to acknowledge that too.
And I know Nancy had the next question. I just wanted to make a real quick plug. I know Sarah and Coral have been working to schedule a follow-up conversation with our colleagues at the California Air Resources Board on the fourth investment plan. And then they're also working on the scoping plan, which is more of a policy document around how the state kind of thinks about its, at least the climate change cap and trade funding and investment. And I think that's an opportunity to bring up this piece around the frustrations that folks have had around kind of policy mandates that are that ultimately don't necessarily have the accountability or enforcement that communities ultimately need, and to potentially start thinking about tying funding availability and accessibility to compliance with funding. And I think that needs to come from the ground up.
Okay, well, I really appreciate this discussion and everything that was laid out. And I'm thinking especially about the slide where you had sort of the shifting ground that we're on now, and with climate change and with COVID and other things. And I guess what I just want to throw out, and I would be interested in exploring further, is, you know, given that these processes are so slow and the shifts that are needed are so gigantic, like, how are we actually going to manage through this next time period? I mean, I'm a person who, I think that we're like in the beginning of a collapse, you know, major collapse, and that things are going to be escalating. And how do we get leadership in position that actually could take emergency actions and, you know, change policies that were developed and set, you know, in a time period when things weren't shifting so rapidly? Like, how do we develop the leadership to be flexible and thoughtful, and that is based on, like people were suggesting, you know, standards of justice and equity, even if we don't have the time frame to do all of the consulting and, you know, consulting and inclusion, et cetera, of peoples. I mean, I just think we really have no idea what's about to hit us in terms of the impacts, and that, you know, the shocks to the food system and availability of water, and, you know, airports going underwater and things like that. It's all going to be happening pretty quickly. So just wanted to open it up a little bit further and see what you thought.
Great points. I'll quickly say, and others may want to jump in here too, that one of my favorite chapters of a general plan guidelines is our chapter on equity and resilience. And I feel like it was written 3 or 4 years ago when we were just at the cusp of beginning to understand how important this was in reframing the planning conversation in California. I think we want to rewrite that eventually, because there's a whole new reality that's emerging around racial equity, a lot of consciousness awakening, and a lot of white people, right? Just to say that. There's just a lot of ownership now that we're starting to see really making some headway, and we're not done yet. Like, it's still painful, but just the issue of racial equity, just so much going on that eclipses stuff that was not even barely talked about 3 or 4 years ago when we wrote that chapter. There's a good example of what we're doing. It's like, what's missing here? What does the message need to be on advancing equity? And I, you know, looking to my SGC colleagues too, as resources here as we begin to do that work. The resilience factor as well. I mean, we're just starting to see in more and more that climate adaptation it's an easy scientific exercise, or let's say greenhouse gas reduction planning, like trying to meet emission targets at the local level. For too long, we focused on the technical, the bean counting, and the infrastructure, but we haven't yet really solved for our people. And that's a big failure in climate planning in California the last 10 to 15 years. It's like, how do we center people and communities in the conversation and look at equity and building resilience where it's needed the most? And that's the next set of conversations that we're already having cross agency at the state. We're hoping local governments are doing that as well. We don't want to see just blinders on looking at EJ over here and then looking at climate adaptation over here and not having them connect. We really need to be doing this work in a way that aligns and really prepares ourselves for it. You pointed out, Nancy, what could be a very difficult future. We're all excited that the pandemic's ending, but all the data we have tells us that these wildfires, the smoke, the drought we're about to go into, we're just having trouble with our housing prices and the housing. Like, there's a lot going on that we need to keep making progress on this stuff and making sure that we're prioritizing our most vulnerable communities first as we find solutions. So I totally hear you, and others may want to chime in here as well.
No, I think that's great. Just seeing we only have 6 minutes left. So, and I see 2 folks have their hands raised. I'm going to call on both of you, but if other folks have questions or thoughts or comments, please do drop them in the chat, and we can, if there are like substantial questions, we can pass them along to Eric to just to make the most of this next 6 minutes. So Martha, if you want to quickly ask your question, and then we'll move to Fatima's question after that.
So going back to the part where you're talking about, the elements, of course, we're worried about what elements that the general plan is going to involve. And then when we have civic engagement, that is really the twofold part of what we're trying to achieve here in San Jose County for us. And it comes back to teeth enforcement. How can we write things in a better way that are really mindful of how we want to engage the community? Because tokenization is really where we're coming from. We're coming out of tokenization where it's like we put it in the paper and they didn't come, or we had a meeting and they didn't show up. When the meeting was held at a time that was not when people are going to be able to participate. And how do we structure those mandates so that they are written as deliverables for these folks in their jurisdictions as to how many events they should have, how many actual outreach approaches they should have, what are the structures of these engagements? Because it's too open, vague and ambiguous in the way they represent themselves in the writing that anybody can construe it in any factor. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I've seen in other jurisdictions as I'm working in the general plan and trying to get people to approach this. We just hired a consultant and they're already saying, well, we've already approached. When did you approach anyone? I'm looking at the clock as it ticks to make sure if you move, I'm moving with you. And they're not really engaging with people. And we have, I think when Karen brings up, how do we do things from the floor up, looking at things instead of the ceiling, right? So I think for us, what's helping us as a group is that we have a collaborative of other stakeholders that are looking towards the general plan. I'm working my butt out to teach people what the general plan is, how to engage, how to participate within their own groups, because I feel that if we have a strengthened core, whether it's coming from my end or other stakeholders, as a collective, if we're all working on the same page, there's got to be some resolute that's gonna be of a positive, a stride, rather than just sitting there and kind of waiting for the bomb to fall and then they deliver the papers and say it's been decided and this is how it's going to be. So like I said, it's not a question, more just like I think that this is some of the things that we really need to look at and not just say sounds good, because I'm with Anita. It sounds good on paper, but when it's in practicum, we fall really far. And I know the passion and the desire is there, because I'm seeing it with the transportation, Caltrans. I'm dealing with all these other different groups in government, and I hear them. They're using the words. They're using equity. They're using mindfulness. They're using all the things that we're wanting to incorporate in what we discuss and how we engage. And they're actually starting to understand it. So I think it's just making sure that we use that language so that it's not something that is just tokenized as well.
Yeah, I want to quickly bring up something that I heard that you guys are working on like community needs assessments or like vulnerability type assessment. The work you're doing with your communities is gold for planners that might need to find actionable solutions, and they just don't know it yet. Like planners can write high level policies that are safe and don't piss anyone off, right? But when it comes down to implementation and using that information to inform and empower community action, I think there's a huge opportunity there. So continue to push. You know, this work that you're doing is so foundational, and I would just really strongly recommend that if you see an opportunity as a planning process begins to continue to bring that information, a lot of planners actually would probably be willing to listen and engage you in that way. So just wanted to encourage that as well.
I also just wanted to jump in to say, and I think we've said this in past conversations where we've brought state folks to the table. You know, Eric, you called yourself Professor Eric, but we really want to see this as relationship building. There's a lot of power in having state policymakers and folks like Eric in your Rolodex. And I'm sure Eric and his team would be more than willing to sit down with folks that you're working with, both within your community-based organization networks, as well as with some of the local jurisdiction staff. I think there's a piece, unfortunately, there's a piece of like legitimization of your work that happens when you're able to pull somebody from the state or who provides this guidance to say, you know, we have this relationship, we're having conversations about them with them about effective practices for implementing these policies. We really think you should listen and take us seriously here. So Eric, I didn't want to speak on your behalf, but I think it's important to think about these as relationships.
No, absolutely. We are not just here for local governments. We're here for stakeholders and community folks doing the work on the ground as well. So, you know, happy to, I'll put my email in the chat here really quickly and feel free to reach out.
Thank you for your presentation. Awesome.
Absolutely.
I feel like I learned some stuff. I've been here for 2 years, so that was really great. I know we're just at 1 o'clock, so I wanted to thank you, Eric, again, and really encourage all of you to take down his email and to follow up, have those conversations. Fatima, I'm sorry we didn't get to your comment. I know you dropped it in the chat, but please do take advantage of Eric's willingness. His team is really great, and know they would be happy to help and engage, and we can bring it up again during phase 2, if that makes sense, if that's kind of the direction some of you are going with your needs assessment goals. So thank you again for your time, and hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, and hope to see some of you in an hour for the carbon investment plan. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.